My grandmother's hands were always busy. That's not a sentimental observation. It's the first thing you need to understand if any of this is going to make sense. I grew up in a village called Škofja Loka in the Julian Alps of Slovenia. If you've never been, imagine a place that looks like it was designed to appear on a postcard and then forgotten by the century that followed. Stone bridges, a medieval castle on the hill, the Selška Sora River cutting through the center of town like a vein. My family had been there for as long as anyone could remember. The Petrić family. We filled an entire hillside, my grandmother's house at the top, my parents' house just below, my Uncle Marco's place across the lane, my Aunt Vesna and her husband and their 4 children in the long house at the bottom, cousins, second cousins, a great aunt who might have been 100 years old and who sat in a chair by her window every day, watching the road below with an expression that I now understand was not contentment, but vigilance. We were not isolated. That's important. I had friends. I went to school in Ljubljana. I studied literature at the university there. I was a normal young woman with a normal life, and the village was only the place I went back to, the place that smelled like walnut oil and cold stone and linden tea and wood smoke, the place where 30-some members of my family lived, within shouting distance of one another, and where every Sunday, without fail, we all gathered at my grandmother's long table for dinner. It was at that table that I first noticed what I'm going to describe. And I want to be precise about this, because the instinct, your instinct, reading this, will be to assume I grew up in some dark, repressive household, that the family was a cult, that there were obvious signs of something wrong. There weren't. My childhood was warm. My parents loved each other. My cousins were loud and competitive and funny. My grandmother sang while she cooked and told stories about the old partisans and pinched our cheeks too hard and slipped us coins when our parents weren't looking. But her hands were always busy. Not in the way that old women keep busy knitting, mending, the productive restlessness of a generation that never learned to sit still. No, my grandmother's hands were busy in a specific way. She was always making something: braided bread, folded pastry, carved butter, and the things she made followed patterns I didn't have names for until I was much older, patterns that repeated in ways I initially mistook for habit, but which I now know were precise, intentional, required. Every Sunday dinner, the bread was braided in a specific configuration. I don't mean she used the same recipe. I mean the number of strands changed according to something, a calendar I didn't understand, or a count I wasn't privy to. Sometimes 4 strands, sometimes 7. Once, on a Sunday in late October, when I was maybe 12, 9 strands, and my grandmother's face, while she braided it, was the most focused I had ever seen any human being. The bread was always placed in the center of the table before anyone sat down. It was always the last thing cleared. And no matter how much we ate, and there were over 30 of us, so we ate a great deal, the bread was never finished. Not because we were full, because, at a certain point, my grandmother would say, calmly and without emphasis, "That's enough of that." And whoever was reaching for the bread would stop. Nobody questioned it. I didn't question it. When you grow up inside a pattern, the pattern is just the shape of your life. You don't see the edges. The other customs were similarly embedded. I'll describe them because you need to understand how many there were and how naturally they sat inside a family that, from the outside and mostly from the inside, seemed entirely normal. We never ate after dark in the months between October and March. Dinner was always finished before sunset, and in the winter, when the sun dropped behind the mountains by 4 in the afternoon. This meant we ate what most people would consider lunch, and then simply did not eat again until morning. My mother once told me, when I complained about being hungry at 8 p.m. on a December night, that eating after dark in winter was bad for the stomach. She said it with total conviction. I think she believed it. I think her mother had told her something similar, and she had absorbed it the way children absorb everything, not as a rule, but as a fact of the world, like gravity or the color of the sky. We never sang in the house after someone in the family died. Not for a day or a week, for a full year. When my great-uncle Borut died in 2006, the silence lasted from January to January. My cousin Luca, who was 8, hummed a song at the dinner table in March of that year, and my Aunt Vesna put her hand over his mouth so fast and so hard that he cried. She apologized immediately. She held him and rocked him and said she was sorry. But her eyes went to my grandmother first, and my grandmother gave a single nod, and my aunt's shoulders dropped like a weight had been removed. We always set one extra place at the Sunday table, always. The plate, the glass, the silverware, all of it laid out with the same care as every other setting. No one sat there, no one referenced it. The food served onto that plate was real food, a full portion, as generous as anyone else's. It was never eaten, obviously, and after dinner my grandmother would scrape it into a specific ceramic bowl, white, old, with a pattern of leaves around the rim that didn't match any of the other dishes in her kitchen, and carry it out the back door. She would walk up the hill behind the house to where the tree line started, and she would leave it there. She did this in rain, in snow, in August heat. She did it until her knees made the hill impossible, and then my mother did it, and when my mother's back went bad, my Aunt Vesna did it, and no one ever talked about why. We never entered the forest behind my grandmother's house alone, ever. This wasn't just a rule for children. My Uncle Marco, who was 6'3" and had served in the Slovenian armed forces, would not walk into those trees without at least one other family member beside him. When he cut firewood, my father went with him. When my cousins and I played near the tree line as children, there were always at least 2 adults watching, not watching us. I realized later, watching the trees. I could continue. There were dozens of these customs, maybe more. Some were daily, some seasonal, some activated only by specific events, a birth, a death, a marriage, a particular kind of weather. I absorbed them all the way water absorbs salt, completely, invisibly, without knowing it had happened. And for 23 years, I had no reason to question any of it. What changed was language. I was in my final year at the University of Ljubljana, writing my thesis on ritual structures in Slavic folk narratives. I was interested in the way certain story patterns, the prohibited room, the tasks given in threes, the figure at the crossroads, appeared across cultures, with variations so slight they almost seemed like transcription errors rather than independent inventions. My advisor, Professor Kovac, was a careful, methodical woman who had spent her career cataloging oral traditions from the rural communities of the Slovenian Alps, and she had assembled an archive of recorded interviews with elderly residents of villages across the Kamnik-Savinja range, the Socha Valley, and the area around Škofja Loka. My area. My family's area. The first interview I found was with a woman named Zala Hribar, recorded in 1987. She was 81 at the time. She lived in a village about 9 kilometers from mine, on the other side of the same forested ridge. The interview was 90 minutes long, and most of it was standard ethnographic material, harvest traditions, wedding customs, stories about the war. But at the 53-minute mark, Professor Kovac asked her about household protections, and Zala Hribar said something that made me stop the recording and sit very still for a long time. she said. You braid it to show you remember the shape. You leave the plate to show you remember the debt. You don't sing because singing tells it you've forgotten why you're quiet. And you never go into the trees alone because alone is how it counts you. The word she used, it, was tisto in Slovenian, which is the neuter demonstrative pronoun. Not he, not she. That thing. And the way she said it was not frightened. It was practical. The way you'd say, you don't touch the stove because it's hot. I listened to the rest of the interview. Zala Hribar described a set of household customs that were, allowing for minor regional variation, identical to my family's. The braided bread, the extra place setting, the prohibition on eating after dark in winter, the prohibition on singing after a death, the paired entry into forests. She described them with the same matter-of-fact tone my mother used, the same lack of mythology or drama. They were just things you did. But then Professor Kovac asked her directly, what is it that these practices are meant to address? And Zala Hribar said, you don't address it. You maintain the agreement. What agreement? A long pause on the recording. 15 seconds. 20. Then, the families on this ridge made an arrangement a long time ago, before the Austrians, before the Church, before the Romans. The arrangement is that we continue, and it continues, and neither side takes more than what was agreed. What was agreed? I don't know exactly. My mother didn't know exactly. Her mother probably didn't either. But we know what to do, and that's enough. Knowing what to do is the agreement. I sat in the university library with my headphones on and my hands in my lap, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not fear, not yet. Recognition. The feeling of seeing a word written down that you've only ever heard spoken and realizing it has a spelling, a structure, an existence outside of your own mouth. I pulled every interview from the Škofja Loka region. There were 14. 7 of them contained some reference to household customs matching the pattern Zala Hribar described. In 3 of those 7, the interviewees used the word agreement or arrangement. In 2, they referred to the families on the ridge. In 1, a man named Frank Dolina, interviewed in 1991, age 77, the interviewer pressed harder than Professor Kovac typically did, and Frank Dolina said something that I've never been able to fully set down afterward. He said, my father told me that his grandfather remembered when the arrangement was new, which means it's not as old as people think. Maybe 200 years, maybe 250. Before that, there was no arrangement. And before the arrangement, the ridge lost a family every generation. Just gone. House standing, animals in the pen, food on the table, family gone. And then the arrangement started, and the disappearances stopped, and now we do what we do, and nobody disappears, and that's the end of it. The interviewer asked, but what was taken in exchange for the safety? Frank Dolina laughed. Not a frightened laugh, an exasperated one. What do you think the plate is for? I went home that weekend. I hadn't planned to. I usually went back once a month, but I drove the 40 minutes from Ljubljana to Škofja Loka on a Wednesday afternoon, parked in front of my parents' house, walked up the hill, and knocked on my grandmother's door. She was 89. Her mind was perfect. Her eyes were the color of wet slate, and when she opened the door and saw me standing there on a day I was not expected, something crossed her face that I had never seen before. It wasn't surprise. It was assessment. She was looking at me, the way you'd look at a clock to see what time it is. You've been in the archive, she said. I hadn't told her about my thesis topic. I hadn't told anyone in the family. I said yes. She let me in. She made coffee, real coffee, Turkish style, in the copper pot she'd had since before I was born. She set it on the table between us, and she sat down across from me, and she folded her hands, those hands, always busy, now perfectly still, and she said, "Ask." So I asked. I asked about the bread, I asked about the plate, I asked about the singing, and the dark, and the trees. I asked about the word arrangement. My grandmother listened to each question with her eyes on mine and her hands motionless, and when I was done, she said, "Good. You're the one then." The one what? Every generation, somebody asks. Usually it's later. Your mother never asked. Your aunt never asked. Marco almost asked, but then he went to the army, and by the time he came back he'd decided he didn't want to know, so he just does what he does and doesn't think about it. But someone always asks, because the arrangement requires at least one person in every generation who understands what they're maintaining and why. She got up and went to the cabinet above the stove, a high cabinet that I had never, in 23 years, seen anyone open. She brought down a wooden box, dark with age, the grain so polished by handling that it felt like stone. Inside the box were papers, not ancient parchments, not crumbling scrolls. Ordinary paper, some of it lined, some of it the heavy cream stock that people used for formal letters in the mid-20th century. Handwritten pages in ink, in pencil, in what might have been charcoal. Different hands, different decades, different levels of education and penmanship, but all in Slovenian, and all describing the same thing. My grandmother sat back down and said, "Read them in order, bottom to top, then we'll talk." The oldest page was at the bottom. The handwriting was cramped and uneven. Someone who could write, but didn't do it often. There was no date, but the language was old, the phrasing formal in a way that suggested the mid-1800s. It said, "This is what was agreed. The families of the Ridge Petrich, Riba, Dolina, Kosmach, Jaga, and Toplak make this record so that the ones who come after will know what to do and why. We do not fully understand what lives in the forest on the high ridge between our valleys. We know that it has been there longer than any of us. We know that before this agreement, it took families, not people families, whole bloodlines, all at once, in a single night. We know that Priest Matevž tried to drive it out in the year of the Great Snow, and that Priest Matevž was found in 6 places at once the following morning. We know that it cannot be fought. We know that it can be lived with." I turned to the next page. A different hand, steadier, dated 1889. The arrangement, as my mother explained it to me, and as I now explain it to whoever reads this next, the bread shows it we remember how to count its limbs. The number changes because it changes. In summer it has fewer, in autumn it has more. 9 is the most my mother ever braided, and she said 9 means it is at its largest, and when it is at its largest it is the most aware. The plate feeds it. Not the food, the act of setting a place for something you cannot see. This is what it asked for. Not worship, participation. It wants to be included in the way we live. It wants to sit at the table. The singing prohibition after death is because death excites it. Sound after death in the family draws its attention more than usual, and its attention, when focused, is not something the human body tolerates. My mother told me that in her grandmother's time, a child sang 3 days after a funeral, and the child's voice continued coming from the forest for a month after the child was buried. I read that sentence twice, and then I looked at my grandmother, and she was watching me with the patience of a woman who had waited decades for this conversation. "Keep reading," she said. The next page. 1923. A woman's handwriting, beautiful and precise. "I am the keeper of this generation, and I will say plainly what the others were afraid to write. It is not evil. I have felt it. I have stood at the tree line at dusk, and I have felt it the way you feel the sun through cloud. It is enormous, and it is alive, and it is patient, and it is so old that our entire history is something like a single season to it. It does not hate us. It does not love us. It maintains us the way we maintain it. The food we leave is not eaten, it is acknowledged. The bread we braid is not consumed, it is read. We are its language. Our customs are its vocabulary. And as long as we keep speaking it, we are part of its sentence, and it does not erase what it is still using. A man. Short, blunt entries. Toplak family stopped observing in 1943. Said it was superstition. Said the partisans had shown them that the old ways were chains. By 1947, there were no toplaks on the ridge. House standing. Animals alive. No toplaks. No bodies. No evidence of violence. Just absence. The other 5 families reinforced observation. I taught my daughters myself. The arrangement is not optional. Another woman. I want to be clear for whoever reads this next. The customs are not symbolic. They are functional. They are the mechanism by which the arrangement operates. Changing them is not modernization. Changing them is breach. I know this because in 1962, my sister Annika decided that the extra plate was wasteful and refused to set it. Nothing happened that day. Nothing happened that week. But over the following month, Annika began to feel watched. Not metaphorically. Physically. She said she could feel weight on her skin when she was alone, like hands made of attention. She set the plate again. It stopped. But for the rest of her life she died in 1965. She said the weight never fully went away. She said it had noticed her specifically, and once it noticed you specifically, the noticing didn't entirely end. My grandmother's handwriting. I recognized it immediately, the same hand that had written my birthday cards for 23 years. I am Marta Petrich, and I am the keeper of this generation. The Jagar family has left the ridge. Not disappeared, left. Moved to Kranj. They said they were done with the old nonsense. I visited Branko Jagar before they went, and I told him what would happen, and he called me a superstitious old woman and said the future didn't need our fairy tales. The Jagars have been in Kranj for 1 year now. Branko called me last Tuesday. He said his daughter has stopped sleeping. He said she stands at the window of their apartment every night facing south toward the ridge, and she doesn't blink, and she doesn't respond, and in the morning she doesn't remember. He said it started 3 months after they left. He said he wants to come back. I told him the arrangement allows for return, but the return must be total. Every custom, every observance. No exceptions and no delays. He said he understood. The Jagars are moving back next month. I don't know if a year away is something that can be repaired. I don't know if the arrangement tolerates interruption. I will find out. Then, below that, a single line added in different ink, clearly written later. Jagar daughter is fine. 3 months of strict observance and the nighttime standing stopped. But she walks differently now. She tilts her head when she's near the trees, like she's listening. I think it gave her back, but kept something small. I think that's how it teaches us not to leave. I set the papers down. My coffee was cold. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was turning the mountains the color of bruised fruit, and the tree line above my grandmother's house was a dark, uneven border against the sky. You understand now, my grandmother said. It was not a question. I understand that this is what the family believes, I said. Because I was 23 and I had a university education and I was writing a thesis about folk narratives, and the distance between studying a thing and being inside a thing felt, at that moment, like the most important distance in the world. My grandmother smiled, not warmly, precisely. "Come with me," she said. She took me out the back door, up the hill. It was late November, and the sun was already failing. I remember thinking we should eat soon, the old rule about eating before dark, and then realizing with a jolt that the rule was active in my thinking, that it had been active my entire life, that I had never once eaten after dark between October and March, and had never thought to wonder why until 6 days ago in a university library. We stopped at the tree line. My grandmother stood beside me, her breathing labored from the climb, her hand on my arm for balance. The trees were spruce and beech, old growth, the kind of forest that looks identical in every direction once you're 10 meters in. The ceramic bowl from last Sunday's dinner was there, on a flat stone just inside the first row of trunks. It was empty, not scraped clean by an animal, empty, dry, as if the food had evaporated, or been absorbed, or had never been there at all. "Put your hand on the nearest tree," my grandmother said. I looked at her. "I'm right here," she said. "You're not alone. Put your hand on the tree." I put my hand on the trunk of the nearest spruce. The bark was cold and rough and completely ordinary for approximately 2 seconds, and then I felt it. I don't have a good comparison for this. The closest I can come is, imagine you're in a dark room and you put your hand on what you think is a wall, and then the wall breathes, not moves, breathes. You feel the expansion and contraction of something alive beneath the surface, something so large that the rhythm of its breathing is slower than your heartbeat, slower than your breathing, slow enough that you almost can't perceive it as rhythm at all, slow enough that it feels like the world itself is gently expanding and contracting, and you realize that the thing you're touching is not the tree. The thing you're touching is wearing the tree the way you're wearing your coat. I pulled my hand back. My grandmother caught it, held it, squeezed it. "Now you know," she said. "That's what we maintain. That's what the bread and the plate and the silence are for. Not to keep it away, to keep it calm, to keep it fed, to keep it knowing that we know it's there and we haven't forgotten and we aren't going to stop." We walked back down the hill. She made more coffee. She told me the rest, the arrangement, as she understood it, and she was careful to say, "as I understand it," because one of the principles passed down through the papers was that complete understanding was not possible and was not the point worked. Like this. The thing in the forest was not a creature in the way we use that word. It was not a discrete organism. It was more like a condition, a property of the ridge itself. It had been there before people, and it would be there after people. It was aware, but its awareness was not like ours. It operated on a time scale so different from human experience that direct communication was essentially impossible. The arrangement was the closest thing to communication that had ever been achieved. The customs were a language. The bread told it we perceived its current state. The plate included it in our social structure. The food carried up the hill was not nourishment, but acknowledgement, a physical act that said, "We know you're here and we are acting accordingly." The singing prohibition was a concession. It wanted silence near death, because death was one of the few human events that occurred on a timescale it could perceive. A human life was too fast for it to follow. But death, the transition, the absence was slow enough to interest it, and its interest, when aroused, was physically dangerous. Not because it intended harm, but because its attention had weight, had presence, had a kind of gravitational density that human tissue couldn't withstand. "Think of it like standing too close to a bonfire," my grandmother said. "The bonfire doesn't want to burn you, but if you stand close enough, you burn. Its attention is heat. The customs keep us at the right distance." "And the trees," I said. "Why never alone?" "Because alone is how it counts," she said, exactly as Zala Hribar had said on the recording 36 years earlier. When there are two people, it perceives a group. Groups are part of the arrangement. When there's one person, it perceives an individual. Individuals are interesting. Interesting things get its attention. You already know what its attention does. The Toplak family, I said. 1947. My grandmother nodded. They stopped. It noticed they stopped. It looked at them all at once. The whole family. And they were not there anymore. Not dead, not taken, not moved, just not there. As if they had never been there. Branko Toplak, the last Toplak on any register anywhere, was born in 1902, and by 1948 there was no record of a Branko Toplak being born anywhere in Slovenia. The church records were blank where his baptism should have been. The school registers didn't have his name. The house was still standing, but the land registry said it belonged to no one. It had always belonged to no one. I stared at her. That's not possible. No, she agreed. It's not, but it's what happened. And that's why we do what we do. I want to tell you that I resisted. That I went back to Ljubljana and applied critical thinking and found rational explanations and wrote my thesis about the sociological function of shared ritual in isolated mountain communities. I want to tell you that's what happened. Here's what actually happened. I went back to Ljubljana. I sat in my apartment. I opened my laptop. I tried to write, and I could feel the distance. Not emotional distance. Not homesickness. Physical distance. I could feel, in my body, the 40 kilometers between my apartment and the ridge. I could feel it the way you feel a rubber band stretched between your ribs and something far away. It wasn't painful. It was informational. It was my body telling me that I was connected to something and that the connection had a length and that I was near the end of it. I lasted 3 days. On the third night, I dreamed that I was setting the table for Sunday dinner, and the extra plate, the one for the thing in the forest, was set in front of my chair. And when I sat down, the chair on the other side of the plate was occupied. I couldn't see by what, but I could feel the weight of its attention, and it was warm, and it was patient, and it knew my name. Not my human name, a name I didn't know I had. A name that described my function in the arrangement, what I was for, what role I played, how I fit into the grammar of the customs that kept everything in balance. I drove home the next morning. I walked up the hill. I knocked on my grandmother's door. 3 days, she said, letting me in. Your mother lasted a week. I lasted 2. 2 days. 2 hours. I knew the moment my mother told me. I never had any doubt. I moved back to Škofja Loka. I finished my thesis remotely, defending it over video call, and I told my advisor that I wanted to stay close to my family for personal reasons, and she accepted this because it was true, even though the reasons were not the kind you put in an email. The first year was the learning year. My grandmother taught me every custom in detail, not just the ones I'd grown up observing, but the deeper ones. The ones that only the keeper knew. There were seasonal adjustments I'd never been aware of. In March, when the snow begins to melt, the bread shifts from wheat to rye, because the thing in the forest responds to the change in the ground, and rye acknowledges that response. In midsummer, the plate at the table is set with a small stone on it, a specific kind of stone, gray-green, pulled from the riverbed because in summer the thing contracts, draws inward, and the stone tells it that we know it's resting and we're maintaining the customs even when its presence is minimal. On the winter solstice, every family on the ridge lights a fire in their hearth and keeps it burning until dawn, and no one sleeps. And the reason no one sleeps is because the solstice is when the thing is most fully awake, and sleeping in its full awareness is my grandmother hesitated here. Not recommended. What happens? I asked. You dream what it dreams, she said, and what it dreams is too large for a human mind to hold. Old Jaga Branco's father fell asleep on solstice night in 1931. He woke up unable to speak any language. Not aphasic, he could make sounds, he could form words, but the words weren't Slovenian or German or anything anyone recognized. He spoke like that for 3 weeks, and then one morning he woke up normal again, and he said he'd been speaking a language that described things that didn't have human shapes, and he could still remember some of it, and he wished he couldn't. I learned. I practiced, I observed, and slowly, over the course of that year, the shape of my life changed. Not in a way that felt like loss. That's what I want to emphasize, because the story you're probably expecting is one where I mourn my freedom, where I resent the obligation, where I spend the rest of my account trying to escape. I didn't. The arrangement felt, once I understood it, like the most honest relationship I'd ever been in. Most of the systems humans live inside are invisible and unacknowledged economic systems, social hierarchies, power structures that shape every moment of our lives while we pretend we're free agents making independent choices. The arrangement was different. The arrangement was explicit. Here are the terms. Here is what we give. Here is what we get. Here is the consequence of stopping. What we got was continuity. 6 families on a ridge in the Slovenian Alps, unbroken for 2 centuries. No mysterious disappearances, no unexplained deaths, no madness, no plague, no catastrophe. Just life, continuing, generation after generation, in the shadow of something enormous and incomprehensible that could erase us from reality itself if we stopped doing the simple things that acknowledged its existence. That was the deal, and it was, I thought, a good deal. I was wrong. Not about the deal, about the simplicity. The first sign that something was changing came in my 2nd year as keeper. January. Deep winter. The snow was heavy that year, 2 meters on the ground, and the trees on the ridge were bowed under it, and the Sunday dinners were crowded and loud and full of the steaming, hearty food that Slovenian winters demand. My grandmother was 90 at this point, still sharp, still present at every dinner, but slower now, quieter, her hands finally still more often than not. It was my cousin Anna who noticed. Anna was Vesna's youngest daughter, 17, fierce and funny, and the kind of teenager who notices everything and announces it without filter. She was sitting next to the empty the plate for the thing in the forest, and in the middle of dinner she said, loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "The plate is warm." Conversation stopped. Not the way it stops when someone says something embarrassing, the way it stops when a fire alarm goes off. Total, instantaneous silence. 30-some people frozen mid-sentence, mid-bite, mid-gesture. I looked at the plate. Anna was right. I could see it. The faintest shimmer of heat rising from the surface of the porcelain, like the air above a road in summer. The food on the plate, a serving of goveja juha, beef soup. My grandmother's recipe was steaming more than it should have been. Not cooling, heating. My grandmother, from the far end of the table, said one word, "Good." And then conversation resumed, and no one mentioned it again for the rest of the meal, and afterward, when I carried the plate up the hill to the tree line, the ceramic bowl was not where I had left it the previous week. It was 10 meters further into the forest, and beside it, arranged in a neat line on the snow, were 6 stones, gray-green, river stones, the kind we placed on the summer plate. 6 stones, 6 families. I told my grandmother. She closed her eyes and breathed out slowly and said, It's confirming the count. What does that mean? It means it's paying more attention than usual. It's checking that all 6 families are still here, still observing. Why now? She opened her eyes. I don't know. I've been keeper for 46 years and it has never done this. My mother was keeper for 30 years before me and she never reported anything like it either. This is new. New was not a comforting word in the context of an arrangement that relied on repetition, on consistency, on the unbroken performance of customs that had remained essentially unchanged for 2 centuries. Over the following weeks, I visited the other families, the Hraibas, the Dolinas, the Kosmach, the Jagas. Each family had its own keeper, the one who knew, the one who asked, and each keeper confirmed that they had noticed changes, small ones, the kind of changes you wouldn't register unless you were looking. Maja Hriba said the trees behind her family's house had grown, not over months or years, over days. Branches that had been bare in December were suddenly heavy, with green growth in January, in the middle of winter, in temperatures well below freezing. The growth was only on the side of the trees, facing downhill, facing the houses. Tomasz Dolina said he'd found footprints in the snow behind his woodshed. Not animal prints, not human prints. Impressions. Circular, about 40 centimeters across, pressed deep into the snow in a line that began at the tree line and ended at the wall of his house and then simply stopped. As if whatever had made them had walked up to his wall and then ceased to exist, or gone through. Natasha Kosmach, who was the youngest keeper on the ridge, only 19, said she'd woken up 3 nights in a row to find every door in her family's house standing open, not just unlocked, open, including the doors that had been bolted from the inside, including a door to a cellar that hadn't been opened in years because the stairway had partially collapsed. That door was open too, and the collapsed stairs had been cleared. And old Branko Jagar, the one who'd tried to leave, the one whose daughter had stood at the window, said something that frightened me more than any of the rest. He said the extra plate at his family's table had cracked, spontaneously, in the middle of a meal. A clean split, right down the center, and when he picked up the 2 halves, the inner surface of the porcelain was warm, and there was a pattern in the glaze that hadn't been there before. He showed me the pieces. The pattern looked like a root system, or a map, or a web of veins. I convened a meeting. This had never been done before. As far as I knew, the keepers of each family had always operated independently, maintaining their own customs within their own households, coordinating only through occasional visits and the shared archive in my grandmother's box. But the changes were simultaneous, they were accelerating, and they seemed to be directional. The thing in the forest was doing something it had never done before, and it was doing it at all 6 families at once. We met at my grandmother's table. 6 keepers, ranging in age from 19-year-old Natasha to 83-year-old Branko. My grandmother sat in her chair by the stove and listened. Maja Hriba spoke first. "It's reaching down," she said. "The growth, the footprints, the doors. It's extending itself toward us. It's never done that before. The arrangement was always, we go up the hill to it, we bring the food to the tree line, we observe the customs in our homes and it stays in the forest. Now it's coming down." Tomasz Dolina said, "Maybe we've done something wrong. Maybe we've missed a custom or changed something without realizing it, and this is the warning." Natasha Kosmach, quiet and careful, said, "Or maybe it's not a warning. Maybe it's the next part." We all looked at her. "The arrangement has existed for 200 years, she said, "but the papers in the box only go back to the 1850s or so. We don't know what the arrangement was before that. We don't know if it was always the same. What if it changes? What if there are stages and we've been in one stage for 2 centuries and now it's moving to the next one? Branko Jaga, who had seen more than any of us, who had watched his daughter stand at a window for months, and who had rebuilt his family's observance from the ground up, said, "If the arrangement is changing, then we need to know what the new terms are. And we can't know that unless it tells us. And it doesn't tell us in words." "The stones," I said. Everyone turned to me. "It left 6 stones. It's never left us anything before. The arrangement has always been one directional. We give, it accepts. But now it left something. 6 stones. 1 for each family." "What do you think they mean?" Maja asked. "I think Natasha is right," I said. "I think it's proposing new terms." My grandmother spoke for the first time. Without opening her eyes, from her chair by the stove, she said, "Bring me the stones." I had them in my coat pocket. I'd been carrying them since I found them, unwilling to leave them anywhere, feeling the same rubber band tension I'd felt in Ljubljana but localized now, concentrated in the space between the stones and my body. I put them on the table. My grandmother opened her eyes, looked at the stones, and picked one up. She held it the way she held bread dough, with familiarity, with expertise, with the knowledge of someone who has spent a lifetime learning the texture of things that matter. She turned it over in her hands. Then she put it on the plate. The extra plate. The one we set for the thing in the forest. The stone sank into the porcelain. Not through it, into it. The surface of the plate accepted the stone the way water accepts a dropped pebble. It yielded, it closed around it, and when the surface settled, the stone was gone, and the plate was whole and unblemished, and there was a new element in the leaf pattern around the rim. Where before there had been leaves and only leaves, now there was a small, round shape among them, a stone, part of the pattern, as if it had always been there. 1 for each family, my grandmother said. Each keeper takes a stone. Each keeper places it on their family's plate. That is the new term. "How do you know?" Tomasz asked. My grandmother looked at him with an expression that I would later understand was the look of someone who has spent 46 years listening to something that doesn't speak and has gotten very, very good at hearing it anyway. "Because that's what it would want," she said. "It wants to be more present. It wants a larger place at the table. It's been sitting at the edge for 200 years, and now it wants to move closer. The stone in the plate is its way of saying, I want to be part of the pattern, not just acknowledged by it." Each keeper took a stone. Each keeper went home. Each keeper placed the stone on their family's extra plate. In every house, the stone sank in. In every house, the plate changed. And in every house, that night, the family reported the same thing, a feeling of warmth in the walls. Not temperature, emotional warmth. A sense of being held, of being attended to, of being, for the first time in the history of the arrangement, cared for by the other party. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever felt, and it was the beginning of the part of this story that I don't know how to tell without sounding like I've lost my mind. Because the thing in the forest started giving back. Not in dramatic ways, in small ones, in practical ones. My Uncle Marco, who had chronic pain in his knees from years of physical work, woke up the morning after I placed the stone and walked downstairs without wincing for the first time in a decade. He stood in the kitchen and bent his knees and looked at my mother with an expression of total bewilderment and said, "They don't hurt." My mother looked at me. I looked at the plate on the table. Natasha Kosmach's mother, who had been slowly losing her sight to macular degeneration, called her ophthalmologist the following week because her vision had improved, not stabilized, improved. The doctor had no explanation. He ran the tests 3 times. The Dolinar family's well, which had been slowly declining in output for years, began producing water at a rate that suggested a new underground source had opened. The water was clean. It was cold. It tasted, Tomasz said, like snow. And the Jagar daughter, the one who had stood at the window, the one who tilted her head near the trees, stopped tilting. She straightened. She smiled. She said, for the first time in years, that she felt like herself again. But she also said something else, something she said to Branko, and Branko told me in private with a voice that couldn't decide whether to be grateful or terrified. She said she could feel it, thinking about her. Not watching her, thinking about her. The way a parent thinks about a child in another room, not with anxiety, not with possessiveness, but with the low, constant hum of awareness that means you are always, always on its mind. Spring came. The customs continued, but they felt different now. The bread braiding, which had always been an obligation, precise, careful, necessary, began to feel like communication. I found myself varying the tightness of the braids, the way I folded the ends, and I found that different variations produced different feelings in the house. A tight braid with tucked ends made the walls feel solid, grounded. A looser braid with open ends made the air feel lighter, more alert. I was learning a language. I was becoming fluent in a language that had no sounds and no symbols, and that was spoken entirely through the shape of bread and the placement of stones and the angle of firelight on old ceramic. The other keepers reported the same thing. We were all learning. We were all becoming more fluent. And the thing in the forest was responding not with more signs, not with more footprints, but with a quality of attention that was increasingly difficult to distinguish from affection. My grandmother died in April of that year. She died at the table. Sunday dinner, mid-sentence. She was telling a story about her mother, some childhood memory, something with goats, and then she stopped and her eyes went soft, and she leaned slightly to the left, and she was gone, peaceful, instant. The kind of death that doctors call a good death, which is a strange phrase, but one I understand now. We did not sing. The year of silence began. And on the night of her death, I carried the plate up the hill to the tree line as I always did. But this time, I stopped and stood in the dark and put my hand on the nearest tree and said, out loud, "She's gone." The tree was warm. In April, in the mountains, at night, the tree was warm. And beneath my hand, in the slow rhythm I'd felt before, I felt a change, a skip, a syncopation, as if the thing's great, slow breath had hitched, as if it had, God, 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 in its ancient and incomprehensible way, registered the loss. The bowl was already empty when I looked, but beside it, where the 6 stones had been months earlier, there was a 7th stone, smaller than the others. A different color, not gray-green, but a deep, warm amber, almost translucent, like a piece of the forest floor compressed into crystal. I picked it up, and it was warm, and it pulsed once against my palm, a single, deliberate compression. Like a hand squeezing mine, and I understood what it was. It was a condolence. I cried. I stood at the tree line in the dark, with a stone in my hand, and I cried for my grandmother, and I cried because the thing that had terrified generations of my family, the thing that could erase bloodlines from reality, the thing that we had spent 2 centuries managing and appeasing and maintaining a careful distance from, had noticed that my grandmother was dead and had given me a stone that felt like sympathy. I put the amber stone on my grandmother's plate, her personal plate, not the arrangement plate. It sank in the same way, and the pattern that appeared in the glaze was not a stone among leaves. It was a hand, an open hand, fingers spread, in the exact gesture my grandmother used when she said, "Enough." At the table, her gesture, her hand, rendered in ceramic by something that had been watching her for 90 years and remembered. I kept the plate. I have it now. I'm looking at it as I write this. The 2nd year after my grandmother's death was when the arrangement began to change in ways that I couldn't manage through bread and stones and silence. The other keepers felt it too. The thing wasn't just reaching toward us anymore. It was growing through us. I don't mean possession. I don't mean infiltration. I mean that the boundary between the forest and the village was becoming less distinct. Not physically, the tree line didn't move. The houses didn't change. The river still cut its familiar path through the valley. But perceptually, experientially, the distinction between the thing in the forest and the families on the ridge was becoming harder to locate. It started with shared sensation. I would be kneading bread in my kitchen, and I would feel the wind in the canopy of trees 300 meters up the hill. Not imagine it, feel it. The sway, the resistance, the way each branch negotiated with the air. I would be washing dishes, and I would feel roots in wet soil. The slow, hydraulic pull of water through systems so vast that my own circulatory system felt like a tributary. These sensations were not intrusive. They didn't override my own experience. They layered underneath it, like a bass note beneath a melody, always present, always felt, never quite loud enough to drown out the song of my own life. The other families reported it differently. Maja Hriba said she could feel the health of her family members, the way you feel the weather as an ambient condition, a background sense that told her who was well and who was struggling without anyone needing to speak. Tomasz Dolinar said he had begun to understand the growth patterns of his crops, not through observation, but through something closer to memory, as if he had grown before and knew the feeling from the inside. Natasha, young and open and less burdened by the weight of expectation, said simply that she felt like she was part of a larger body, and that the larger body was kind. And old Branko Jaga, who had resisted the longest and feared the most, said that his daughter had started braiding her hair in patterns that matched the bread, not mimicking, inventing, creating new configurations that Branko had never seen, but that, when he looked at them, felt correct, felt like valid sentences in the language we were all learning to speak. I called another meeting. This time, we didn't meet at the table. We met at the tree line. All 6 keepers, standing in the last light of a June evening, looking into the forest that was no longer just a forest and hadn't been for a very long time. It's integrating, I said. It's not replacing us. It's not consuming us. It's integrating. It's making us part of itself, or itself part of us, and I don't think there's a difference between those two things. Is that bad? Natasha asked. I opened my mouth to say yes, to say that any loss of boundary between the human and the inhuman was by definition dangerous, by definition a form of consumption, by definition the beginning of the end. That was the story I knew, the story from the papers, from the archive, from 2 centuries of careful distance maintained through ritual and repetition. But the word that came out of my mouth was, I don't know. Because the truth was that nothing bad had happened. The healings were real. The shared sensation was gentle. The integration, if that's what it was, felt less like being eaten and more like being included. And the question I couldn't answer, the question that keeps me up at night even now, especially now, was whether my inability to perceive the danger was because there was no danger, or because I was already too far inside the thing to see its edges. That night, I dreamed again. The same table, the same extra plate, but this time, every plate at the table had a stone in it. Every setting was part of the arrangement. And the figure in the chair across from me was no longer invisible. It was there. I couldn't describe its shape. It wasn't a shape, not in any way that visual language can capture. It was a presence that filled the chair the way a sound fills a room, completely and without boundary, and it was looking at me, and its look was the most complex thing I had ever experienced. It contained patience and hunger, and something that I would call love, if love could exist, on a time scale that made individual human lives as brief as heartbeats. It reached across the table, not with a hand with attention, with the focused, warm, gravitational attention that my grandmother had compared to standing near a bonfire. And it touched the plate in front of me, my plate, my personal plate. And it said, not in words, not in sound, but in the language of bread and stone and silence that I had been learning for 2 years. It said, "You are invited to sit closer." I woke up. It was 3 a.m. Every door in my house was open. The air was warm. The walls were humming with a frequency I could feel in my teeth. And on my kitchen table, on the plate I'd eaten dinner from the night before, there was a stone, not gray-green, not amber, black, dense, warm, pulsing with the same slow rhythm I felt in the trees. I picked it up. It was heavy, heavier than a stone that size should be. And when I held it, I could feel the entire ridge, every house, every sleeping family, every keeper lying awake in their bed with the same stone in their hand, because I knew, without checking, that it had given one to each of us, at the same moment, on the same night. 6 black stones, 6 invitations. I held the stone, and I felt the thing in the forest feeling me hold it, and I understood that we had arrived at a threshold. The arrangement had been renegotiated once, when the gray-green stones appeared. Now it was being renegotiated again, and this time the terms were not, "Acknowledge me more." The terms were, "Become part of me." Not, "Stop being human." Not, "Dissolve into the forest." Not, "Disappear." The Toplaks disappeared because they broke the arrangement. This was different. This was an offer of deeper integration. A closer seat at the table, a merging that, as far as I could tell, would leave us ourselves, but would add something, a layer of perception, a degree of connection, a participation in an existence so much larger than our own that the word larger barely begins to describe the scale. I didn't place the stone. Not that night. I held it. I sat at my table and I held it, and I thought about my grandmother and the papers in the box and the 2 centuries of careful distance, and I tried to think about what she would say. She would say, "The arrangement is not optional," but she would also say, "The arrangement changes." And she had placed the first stone without hesitation, because she understood something that the papers didn't contain, and that I was only beginning to learn. The arrangement was not a cage, it was a conversation. And conversations evolve, they deepen. They move toward places that neither party could have predicted when the first word was spoken. Morning came. I called the keepers. All 5 had received the stone. All 5 had stayed awake holding it. All 5 had felt the invitation. And all 5 asked me the same question: what do we do? I was the Petrich keeper. My family's house was at the top of the ridge, closest to the tree line. In the unspoken hierarchy of the arrangement, the Petrich had always been first to maintain, first to observe, first to ask. My grandmother had been the voice of the keepers for half a century. Now I was. I told them I didn't know. I told them I needed time. They agreed to wait. We would meet again in 1 week, and each of us would bring our stone, and we would decide together. That week was the longest of my life. I maintained the customs. I braided the bread 7 strands, because it was high summer and the thing was resting, and 7 was the resting count. I set the plate. I carried the food up the hill. But every day, the black stone sat on my table and pulsed, and every night I dreamed of the table and the presence and the invitation. And every morning, the integration grew a little deeper. I could feel the mycelial networks under the forest floor, millions of connections carrying chemical messages between trees that had been having conversations for centuries. I could feel the water table shifting with the weather. I could feel the thing thinking, not about me specifically, but about everything, about the whole ridge, about the arrangement, about time itself passing at its slow, magisterial pace. By the 5th day, I could feel the other keepers, not their thoughts, their states. Maja was afraid, Tomaj was resigned, Natasha was eager, Branko was exhausted. And the 5th keeper, young Gregor Kosmach, who had taken over from his sister Natasha 6 months earlier when she left for university in Vienna, Gregor was already gone. Not gone, merged. I felt it happen on the 5th morning. A shift in the texture of the shared sensation, a sudden deepening on the Kosmach side of the ridge, and then a feeling of completion. Like a circuit closing. Like a note resolving into a chord. Gregor had placed the stone. Not on the arrangement plate. On his own plate. And the thing in the forest had accepted him, and Gregor Kosmach was still Gregor Kosmach, but was also something else. Something that included the forest, and the ridge, and the mycelium, and the water, and the slow, deep pulse that had been breathing beneath our lives for longer than our lives had existed. I drove to the Kosmach house. Gregor was sitting at the kitchen table. He looked normal. He looked healthy. He looked, if anything, better than he had the week before, more rested, more present, more himself, in a way that was paradoxically more vivid for being more connected. "I couldn't wait," he said. "I'm sorry. I know you said we'd decide together." But it was asking, and the asking felt like the most honest thing anything has ever said to me. "How do you feel?" He thought about it. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "Do you know the feeling when you've been holding your breath and you finally let it out? It's like that, except I didn't know I'd been holding my breath my entire life." I looked at his hands. They were still, not busy, not restless, still in the way my grandmother's hands had been. Still at the very end, not from exhaustion, but from completion. "Can you still choose?" I asked. "If you wanted to stop to go back to how it was before, could you?" He looked at me, and his face did something. I don't have a word for a micro-expression that was not entirely Gregor, that had a depth and a slowness to it, that suggested a time scale longer than a human face should be able to express. "Why would I want to?" he said. "That is the question. That is the center of everything. That is the sentence I carry with me every day and cannot resolve. Why would I want to? It's the same question the papers warned about, in their way. The Toplaks didn't want to leave, they were erased for leaving. The Jagars didn't want to come back, their daughter's suffering forced them. The arrangement has always operated through consequences, not choices. But this, the black stone, the invitation, the integration was being presented as a choice, a genuine one. Place the stone or don't, come closer or stay where you are. The arrangement will continue either way. The customs will be maintained. The bread will be braided. The plate will be set. Nothing changes if you say no. But everything changes if you say yes. And the thing about the yes is that it feels good. It felt good for Gregor. It felt good for the families that experienced the healings and the shared warmth and the sensation of being part of something larger. It feels good right now, holding the stone, feeling the pulse, knowing that the forest is aware of me and that its awareness is not predatory, but inclusive, which means I have no way of knowing whether the good feeling is honest or whether it's the last and most sophisticated mechanism of something that has spent 2 centuries learning how to make us want what it wants. The meeting happened. The 6 keepers sat at the tree line with their stones. Gregor was there, already integrated, calm and present, and subtly different in ways that made the rest of us uneasy, not because they were frightening, but because they were appealing. He looked like a person who had found the answer. We all wanted to look like that. We talked for hours. Maja argued for caution, for maintaining the current arrangement without escalation, for keeping the distance that had kept 6 families alive for 2 centuries. Tomasz argued that the decision wasn't ours to make, that the thing had changed the terms, and we could either accept or face consequences we couldn't predict. Branko, old and tired, and still carrying the memory of his daughter at the window, said he was going to place the stone because he was 83, and the worst that could happen was he'd die faster, and the best that could happen was he'd die as part of something that would remember him in a way that human memory couldn't match. Natasha, calling from Vienna, said she hadn't placed the stone and didn't intend to. She said distance had given her perspective that proximity couldn't. She said that from 400 kilometers away, the pull felt exactly like addiction, like something designing the precise sensation of well-being that would make refusal feel like self-harm. You can't trust a feeling that was engineered to be irresistible, she said. That's not consent, that's manufacture. Gregor said, quietly, it isn't engineered. I'm inside it. I can feel the whole structure. There's no deception in it. There's no manipulation. It's just large. It's so large that being close to it feels overwhelming. And we're interpreting the overwhelm as seduction because we don't have a framework for something that's genuinely, neutrally, non-coercively enormous. That's exactly what you'd say if you'd been compromised, Natasha said. That's exactly what you'd say if you were afraid, Gregor replied. They were both right. They are both still right. This is the part that doesn't resolve. I didn't place the stone that night. I went home, and I put it on the shelf beside my grandmother's plate, and I stood in my kitchen, and I felt the forest breathing on the ridge above me, and I made a decision. I would write this down, all of it. Everything I knew, everything the papers contained, everything the keepers had told me, everything I had felt and seen and dreamed. I would write it down and I would send it somewhere far from the ridge, somewhere the pull couldn't reach, and I would let someone who had never felt the warmth and never held the stone and never dreamed of the table read it and tell me what they saw. Because I can no longer tell whether I am a woman making a free choice about an unprecedented situation or whether I am a woman who has been shaped across 25 years of customs and bread and silence and stones into something that can no longer distinguish between its own desire and the desire of the thing that raised it. That is what I am giving you. This document, this account, unedited, unfiltered, written in a single sitting at the kitchen table where my grandmother's plate sits with its hand-shaped pattern and its warm, pulsing surface that I have to stop myself from touching every time I walk past. The stone is on the shelf. I haven't placed it, but I haven't given it back either. I carry it in my pocket, sometimes without deciding to. I find it in my hand when I wasn't reaching for it. And when I hold it, the feeling is I need to be honest. The feeling is home. The feeling is belonging on a scale that makes every other belonging I've ever experienced feel like a rough draft. 3 of the 6 keepers have placed their stones. Gregor, Branko, Maja, who argued against it and held out for 2 months and then placed it one night without telling anyone and called me the next morning weeping, not from grief but from relief, and said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I couldn't keep saying no to something that felt like being found. Tomasz is holding. Natasha is in Vienna, unplaced, and says she's never coming back. I am holding. But the forest is patient. The forest has always been patient. 2 centuries is nothing to something that breathes once an hour and thinks in decades. It can wait for me. It can wait for Tomasz. It can wait for Natasha. It has all the time there is, and every Sunday I set the plate, and I braid the bread, and I carry the food up the hill, and the bowl is empty. And beside the bowl, there is always something new, a pattern of twigs arranged in a shape I almost recognize, a stone that's warmer than it should be, a patch of ground where the snow has melted in the outline of a hand. A hand. My grandmother's hand, open, fingers spread, the gesture that means enough, or the gesture that means come here. I have never been able to tell the difference. Tonight is the solstice. Every family will light their fire. No one will sleep. The thing on the ridge will be fully awake, and its wakefulness will fill every house and every room and every pair of lungs on the hillside with the warm, vast, terrifying tenderness of something that has been waiting for us to say yes for longer than our language has existed. The stone is in my hand. I don't remember picking it up. I want to put it down. I want you to know that. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that part of me, the part that wrote this, the part that sent it to you, the part that still remembers what it felt like to be a person with edges, wanted to put it down. But the plate is right there, and it's warm, and there's a place in the pattern where a stone would fit, and it would look so right there. It would look like it had always been there.